Welcome back, everyone. My name is Scott Olson. I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for day 2 of short course number 3 from TAILENG on geotechnical analyses for waste storage facilities. It is with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Andy Small at Clone Krippenberger, who's going to talk to us today about the guidance for slope stability analysis of dams, and in particular tailings dams being developed by ICOLD. So over to you, Andy, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. So greetings. It's a real honor to be part of this group, and what TAILENG is trying to accomplish is excellent. I have 35 years experience in the game, geotechnical engineer, live in Eastern Canada now, but did my undergrad in Eastern Canada, did my master's in Alberta. I've worked for Clone Krippenberger for the past 4 years as a senior staff consultant. Prior to that, I was with Wood or /AMAC. Starting with 25 years ago, I became very active in the Canadian Dam Association. I chaired conferences, led a number of initiatives, but really got going in writing guidance documents. Was the primary author of the Mining Dams Bulletin that we issued in 2014. And since then have been involved in a dozen other guidance document initiatives related to foundation characterization, engineer of record, what a dam is not a dam, and so on. So then about 5 years ago, I became one of Canada's representatives on ICOLD, and was very impressed with what ICOLD was trying to accomplish on the international stage. We started working on the Tailings Dam Safety Bulletin in 2019, and that really has moved along quite well with a view towards issuing it here in October. But starting at this calendar year, I became the chairman of Committee L, or Tailings and Waste Lagoons Committee, and very pleased with what the passion our group has. We started with about 20, we're now at about 40. We've added a number of new countries such as Indonesia and Mozambique and so on, all in an effort to try to get the message out about tailings dam safety internationally. So it's a real pleasure to be here and represent ICOLD. So I'm going to start with a bit of context of the situation and why we're doing what we're doing. Before getting into the ICOLD slope stability guidance, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview on the Tailings Dam Safety Bulletin. It kind of frames the guidance, and then a brief discussion on post-seismic stability analysis. I have about 60 slides. I expect it'll take about 45 or 50 minutes to get through the slides, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and discussion after that. And I gather that they're handled through the Q&A part of Zoom. So we go back to 2015, and many of you will remember the Fundal failure at the Samarco mine. There were contracted soils in the shell of that dam. The stability analyses that were conducted prior to that, as part of their ongoing stability certificates, had made an assumption that contracted behavior would not occur, and they used drain parameters for factor safety. And when I asked the consultant of the day why, he said, because that's what the regulation said to do. So as we're well aware, it overstated the factor safety and led to an unsafe condition. From the panel report that was prepared, there was a number of cross sections cut. I'm just going to show you some of the stability modeling that was done. This is a typical example at the right abutment, where they used drain parameters. They used cohesion and phi, and it's always interesting to see how tailings can have a cohesion, but that's what they did because they had a bunch of triaxial tests and they drew a straight line to the data and they came up with a cohesion, but that's fine. That's not the challenge we're dealing with here today. And they calculated a factor safety 1.9. They also felt they were in a low seismic area. They knew they had some contractive zones in the dam, but they decided that they didn't need to consider liquefaction because there wasn't a trigger. So they were in a low seismic area, yet they were raising the dam 9 meters a year. Now, if that wasn't a trigger, I don't know what would be. Now, the panel report concluded a very complex chain of events occurred, whereby there was slimes within the shell that led to horizontal deformations, that led to changes of stress state, and that ultimately became the trigger. But had they considered the undrained conditions properly from the beginning and didn't really care about the trigger, they wouldn't have run into this trouble. So the fact there was a trigger almost becomes irrelevant when you had those contractive zones within the dam. if they had run the analysis back then using even peak undrained shear strengths, they would have found an undrained factor safety of 1. And that was based on cone penetration test data they had that clearly showed it was contractive. The factor safety of 1 should have been a flag at the time. But Brazil hasn't been used to running post-liquefaction stability analysis. Had they have done that, they would have taken the cone penetration test data, interpreted an SU over sigma v prime of 0.07, and calculated a factor safety of 0.4. Again, doesn't matter about the trigger. The reality is this is a very large dam. They had the conditions for liquefaction to be triggered. Had they known that this was a type of factor safeties that they were dealing with, maybe then they could have done things to arrest the situation by putting in rockfill buttresses or doing something differently, but they just didn't even know. Brumadinho was similar. The thing that made Brumadinho a little different was the bonding between the tailings particles that created a false strength. And so the owners and the consultant thought they had a very strong tailings and they could build it very high and very steep. But then when the failure started, the bonds broke, and that's what led to the rapidity of that failure happening in like under 20 seconds, the failure occurred. But again, they had testing that showed the tailings were contractive. And some of you may have seen that master's thesis that was issued where this figure came from that showed they were contractive, but they didn't understand what they're dealing with. And had they run a post-liquefaction factor safety, they would have found it less than 1, and they would have been at the stage of understanding they had a potential problem, but they didn't know that. They didn't know that that's what they should be doing. So we have these 2 famous failures in Brazil, but the issue is not limited to Brazil. I practice in Canada, and I was seeing over time many other examples of this happening in Canada. In fact, I had one situation in Ontario where the consultant said that they had a low classification dam. So therefore the seismic event was 1 in 475 year event, and they didn't need to run liquefaction. Flow counts were 1s and 2s. The CPT showed massive dynamic pore pressures and 1 megapascal tip resistances. They had slope angles of 1.5 horizontal, 1 vertical, and they had a head frame immediately downstream of that, that if that dam were to fail, it would have flowed into the head frame. So no, this isn't just a Brazilian issue. We're seeing it around the world. I ran into a very important one in India last year. So in 2016, I created a working group within CDA, and it was just trying to re-educate people about the fundamentals of undrained behavior, building on the work done by Carrier at MIT in the early 1980s, stuff that Scott's been doing. All kinds of people have been talking about this, but for some reason, the message had not been getting out. So I created a working group in 2016 with a view towards updating the CDA guidance and trying to provide improved guidance under CDA, recognizing that the Canadian Dam Association guidance is used internationally in many jurisdictions. And we thought if we could get it into the CDA guidance, then at least there's a hope of getting that message out to others. However, I only got it so far. I got to like version 45 of that guidance. And then I changed gears and moved it over to ICOLD. And the reason for that is because at the time I was preparing the guidance in 2016, 17, and 18, ICOLD wasn't working on an international guidance. In 2018, we started on that, and it made a lot of sense to migrate it all over to ICOLD. So the concepts that we're going to show you today in ICOLD really came from our CDA work, and they're not new. They just are documented maybe in a guidance document. And the thing we also did at ICOLD is we tried to provide some framework in terms of the what if, the gray zones. So to help frame the slope stability analysis part of the bulletin, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the bulletin itself. Harvey McLeod with Klonkrip and Berger, who was chair of the ICOLD Tailings Committee for 10 years, did the heavy lifting. He was a primary author on it, supported by a number of us that contributed to the bulletin. As I said, it started in 2018 when we said we really needed a consistent approach for international tailings dam safety. And this came from work that many of us are doing internationally as they were going through audits and reviews after the Fundão failure. And people are trying to understand, do their dams have similar characteristics of Fundão? And you would go to Kazakhstan and they would be following things in civil law, and they had a checklist on how to do dam safety. which had nothing to do with reality we deal with. And then you go into Africa where they had very, very little regulatory strength and no guidance. So we thought there was a lot of value in having international guidance. That was before the GISTM came out, which was all really mainly governance aspects, although it calls out you have to deal with brittle behavior. Then ICMM issued their guidance, their conformance protocols, or good practice guide. So what we did at ICOLD is we believe that we've complemented the GISTM and ICMM efforts. In 2019, Mike Davies, as some of you know, had this nice graphic showing on the left-hand side the evolution of the GISTM and how then on the right, the GISTM was identifying the specific commitments that was being made. Then the supporting guidance is being housed under ICMM and MAC, which is governance guidance. And then where ICOLD providing the technical support. So we've been very careful about not interfering or intruding into ICMM's domain. We're really focusing on the technical issues. So in that regard, we have a long bulletin, about 180 pages long, supplemented by 2 appendices, and it covers a lot of things. And what you'll see at the start is section 3 is the closure. And you might think, well, typically you'll see closure at the end of a bulletin like this, but we put it first and foremost to continue to reinforce the importance of designing for closure. If you're interested in an overview of the bulletin, we did one on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel we've created at ICOLD Tailings Committee, and you can go to that YouTube channel, and it's about a 3 or 4 hour video that goes through all of those chapters. And here's really the crux of the matter related to our discussion this evening is appendices A and B, where we thought there was a lot of value trying to provide information to the practitioner on shear strength deformation behavior, soils and tailings. And then how do we take that information and create a framework for dealing with contracted soils in what I will refer to as the gray zone. So section 7 is on design, and I'm showing you this just to give you an understanding of the elements within the design chapter. You'll see it's rather comprehensive, and the slope stability assessment is section 7.9 of section 7. And before that, you'll see things such as risk-informed design. Under risk-informed design, we talk about performance-based risk-informed design. We talk about the observational method and how it should and should not be used. And that kind of frames some of the discussion we have later on in slope stability assessment. So getting into the actual slope stability guidance now. Section 7.9 of the slope stability guidance is entitled slope stability assessment, not slope stability analyses. And that's intentional because when you're assessing the stability of a slope, a limit equilibrium analysis we'll be focusing on today is one approach for assessing that stability, but it's not the only one, of course. Nonlinear deformation analyses are also a valuable tool. And if you follow along what Morgenstern was saying about performance-based informed risk designs, that's another piece of the whole stability evaluation. So limit equilibrium that we're going to be focusing on at this session is really just one piece in your overall stability assessment. Another thing I wish to point out is that some of you may be familiar with the practice in Europe that uses limit states design, and we chose not to embrace that within the bulletin. We really believe that the approach that we've described, which is pretty classic in North America, makes a lot of sense internationally. So for those of you that are just learning about slope stability assessment, this is just a typical cross-section where you have a dam. In this case, there's a starter embankment and this upstream constructed with these this outer shell. There's a zonation and geometry that you identify. The material properties are identified. The boundary conditions, such as the phreatic surface, is noted. And then the design loads, such as the height of the dam and so on. And all of those are fed into the stability analysis, where slip surfaces are considered and the factor of safety on the slip surface is calculated. When we're looking at a slope stability assessment, we need to consider a number of factors. Consequences of failure are quite important. If you have a very high consequence dam, you may wish to adopt higher targets of factor of safety than what we're going to talk about here in a moment. Again, if it's a very complex dam with a lot of uncertainty and variability, that could have a real influence on how you deal with the slope stability assessment. Obviously, we're going to spend time talking about the contractive dilative issues, comprehensiveness of site investigations, geotechnical monitoring and informant. This strain incompatibility is a very interesting one because limit equilibrium does not deal with strain incompatibility. And in the observational method, if you have a very robust investigation program with a significant instrumentation, and you're using the observational method the way it was intended, that is, you're not just monitoring for the sake of monitoring, you're monitoring with a contingency plan available, then you could actually get away with a lower factor of safety. What I'm showing you here is Mount Poly. And this is a very interesting example of strain incompatibility. This is a section through the dam that failed in 2014, where a stability model was run, calculating factor safety 1.27. This was done by Clone Crippen as part of a very detailed report that examined the failure of Mount Poly. At Mount Poly, what happened there is a foundation clay, a glacial lacustrine unit, which was thought to be over-consolidated based on early investigations, became normally consolidated as the dam was raised. So it flipped past the pre-consolidation stress of the materials and became normally consolidated. Then with the continued raising, it went undrained and the whole dam failed. So using peak undrained strengths in the clay and the strengths of these materials, the factor safety of 1.3 was calculated. And this is what was happening when the dam was designed. The designer of the day said, I have a factor safety of 1.3, but they were actually calculating it based on over-consolidated strengths at the time, and they were happy because back in 2014, there was an interpretation of the slope stability guidance that said I could accept a 1.3 factor safety for end of construction. And they said, we're still in construction, all that's happy. What they didn't understand was how the clay could change. Dr. Morgenstern had a student, Isabella Toni, which wrote a very interesting paper. It appears in the Canadian Geotechnical Journal, which was a really beautiful paper in terms of how limit equilibrium does not handle these types of situations adequately. They did a three-dimensional deformation analysis and really showed progressive failure. What they showed is that the GLU experienced significant movements exceeding 5% shear strain, went to the undrained condition, went over the peak. Then it started to cause failure in these materials, and the rock fill, whatever strength the rock fill offered, was limited because the stress strain curve of the rock fill was very different than the stress strain curve of the clays and these materials back here. So as a result, when you're into a limit equilibrium model and you put in the peak strengths of the materials, you're inherently assuming that the slip surface will move at the same shear strain along its length, and it'll achieve the same peak strength at the same shear strains. Well, limit equilibrium analysis can't represent that. It can't account for the fact that by the time this has failed, this is reaching a peak. It can't do that. Some of you may have seen Morgenstern's lecture in Hong Kong a few years ago, where he was doing a 25th anniversary of the slope stability analyses. And he was really criticizing limit equilibrium analyses at that time, and rightfully so, because a lot of them were being done improperly, and really advocating for non-deformation linear analysis. He reviewed an early version of the slope stability guidance I was working on for CDA, and he said, Andy, you know, what you're doing is fine for new dams, and what you're doing is fine for many dams as screening tools. But because of this central issue, limit equilibrium is going to be a problem, because at the time they were just wrapping up this thesis. So how do you handle that limit equilibrium? Well, if you have this type of geometry, which is obviously very different in terms of strain parameters and stress strain parameters, well, maybe you handle it through increasing the target factor of safety. In my practice, what I do is I discount the strengths. So you still can handle it limit equilibrium, but you got to go in with eyes wide open. So coming to the target factor safeties, we've only specified two targets in the bulletin: static conditions, minimum target of 1.5, post-liquefaction 1.1. These targets are based on the understanding that you will be following leading international practice for site characterization and parameter selection. So if you're not doing that, if you're drilling 2 boreholes instead of 20, and you're really not following international practice, and you don't understand the foundations properly, then 1.5 doesn't make sense. And the thing about these guidance documents is that people look at the tables and they say that's what it is, and they cast it in stone. You will find many, many words in our document that says, no, don't cast these in stone. Consider them targets and use engineering judgment to establish what is appropriate for your project. There's also been discussions about what's the factor of safety for closure or for operating, or do I need to do things differently for planned dams? That may be, okay? You may have to make modifications to the targets. And then the other thing is slip surfaces. What about these shallow slip surfaces that often people represent as critical? And that becomes the one they report in their slope stability reports. We're saying, no, these should apply to slip surfaces that result in loss of freeboard, significant portion of the dam crest, or damage to critical elements. And I have an example coming up in a couple of slides. In many guidance documents, you will see targets, factors of safety provided for end of construction, rapid drawdown, or seismic and post-seismic loading. We do not provide those. And part of the reason is many people were taking a 1.3 end of construction, and they were building starter dams that were 20 meters high and putting tailings behind it and saying, I can still handle 1.3 as an end of construction because I'm in the middle of construction. Well, if you look at the consequences of failure of that dam, they could be pretty severe. That whole end of construction target of 1.3 that we saw coming out of our hydropower friends was when they're building a dam that's not impounding water. And if the dam were to fail, the consequences were a bit of a mess. They had to clean up and rebuild, but they weren't a catastrophic failure. So we're very clear on that if you're at end of construction on tailings dam, you need to take a look at the consequences of failure, the performance that you've been experiencing, and establish what you think is appropriate. Rapid drawdown for tailings dam, many of them have beaches, that becomes irrelevant. But again, many tailings facilities don't really have a rapid drawdown mechanism. Some they may have decant towers, which can drain the water out quickly, but in today's day, many of them don't have that. And when we're dealing with seismic and post-seismic loading for dams with dilative soils, you'll see that we actually don't prescribe factors of safety for that. We drive the user to deformation modeling. So when I was referring earlier to slip surfaces that mean something, this is what I'm trying to show here. This is an example of a slip surface that we would want to see represented in a slope stability analysis that it adheres to a target of 1.5. As I said earlier, many reports we see have this type of shallow slip surface being reported as a critical slip surface, and we've got to stop doing that. Over here, we have a slip surface passing through a dam that has a thin core and there's drainage elements. In this case here, that could be a problem if there was deformations or movements along that could affect those internal elements. Now, the rate of failure is an important underpinning of this guidance. For saturated soils, we deal with drained and undrained failures. And many of you will understand these terms, but some of you may not. So I'm going to go through this a little slowly because this is a fundamental part of the guidance. In drained failure, the rate of failure is slow enough that excess pore pressures that are generated during shearing dissipate. So the failure would occur in a drained manner. In an undrained failure, the rate of failure is faster than the ability of the excess pore pressures to be dissipated. And what you see here are the terms rate of failure, not rate of loading. So when you're building a dam on a normally consolidated clay and you're building that up, putting 3 or 5 meters of fill on top of a clay, that's a rate of loading. You will get a pore pressure response undrained as a result of that, and that's fine. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is when the dam decides to fail, whatever that trigger may be, whatever failure is starting to develop, is the rate of failure going to be drained or undrained, not the rate of loading. Because you can actually load some materials like a silt in a manner on a construction project. And what I'm dealing with right now, we have all kinds of piezometers in the silt layer, but the rate of loading has not been high enough to trigger an undrained loading in that silt. But with blow counts of 5s and 6s, we're worried about the fact that when it starts to fail, it could be an undrained rate of failure. And fundamentally, most dams fail in undrained or partly undrained conditions. When you look at the failures that you've witnessed in the past 5 or 10 years, have you seen any of them move really, really slowly? No. So this is a very simple geometry that we see for analyzing slope stability, where we take a look at the driving forces, which might be an external loading or the weight of the soil, and then we take a look at the resisting forces here. And there's moments calculated that are causing a sliding and moments that resist the sliding. What people need to understand is this strength that we're talking about here is the strength at or just before or at the point of failure. And so when we're looking at the factor safety calculation, which is really a calculation of the maximum shear strength that can be generated from the soil strength divided by the shear strength required for equilibrium, then we're talking about this maximum soil strength just at or before the point of failure. And that's where this undrained bit comes in on contracted soils. So again, contracted soils, just to reinforce the point, when they're saturated and sheared quickly, such that the pore water pressures cannot dissipate, then the tendency to contract causes an increase in pore water pressures, reduces the strength by over 50%. So I have this little graphic to try to illustrate it further because as often as I use these words and take them for granted, I find this little image tends to help. Picture the soil grains at kind of edge-to-edge contact, and they're waiting to collapse. If you sheared it slowly, if I applied a shear stress to this, the little balls here would fall into the cavities between them, or the house of cards would collapse. But if I was doing it slowly and there's water in the pores, the water would drain out among the balls. If I sheared it quickly, as the balls tried to compress into the water would take the load, and that's what drives the strength down. If I look at a dilative soil, picture this stack of soccer balls. And so it's the same idea. When the shearing happens on the soccer balls, what's going to happen? The balls are going to ride up over top of each other. There's going to be a tendency to dilate if it's done slowly at a drained manner, if it's done in an undrained manner, as those balls kind of try to pull apart to slide over one another, they will actually take the water into tension, which drives the pore pressures down below atmospheric and increases the strength. So again, the rate of failure governs the analyses. And in the stability reports I write, I actually talk about that. I actually say, okay, I have a clay in the foundation. It's going to fail in an undrained manner. It's a contractive clay and therefore using undrained parameters. Because the dam is failing in an undrained manner, I have sands and gravels that are compacted above it. They may also fail in an undrained manner, but they may fail, but then they may generate negative pore pressures. But as a conservatism, I'm not going to count on that. I'm going to continue to assume that they're not generating pore pressures during shearing. So when we talk about failures, and I might comment earlier about who's ever seen a slow failure, well, you could have a drain failure through some sort of tertiary creep mechanism. If you have a pre-sheared clay layer in a foundation, yes, that could happen in a drained manner, because by definition, residual strength is no change in volume, no change in pore pressure during shearing, that could be drained. And Jonathan Bray pointed this out about London clay excavations have actually been experiencing those slow failures in a drained manner for many years. So they do exist, but I believe they're an exception, and we really have to pay attention to the undrained failures. So when we're looking at the slope stability assessment and undrained contractive things, we need to look at triggers. So again, we talked about seismicity or static loading. We are asking for you to consider the peak undrained strength when you get to a factor safety of 1.5 and limit equilibrium. When you're dealing with clays that have not been pre-sheared, that have not got past their peaks, then do you need to look at a large strain strength condition as well? And that actually relates to the post-liquefaction of tailings. It's a little similar. When we're talking about post-liquefaction of tailings or a granular material, we will target a factor safety of 1.1 for that. We assume that there's a significant strength loss beyond the peak undrained strength, but the same can happen in clays. And clays can lose a lot of strength. Now, the thing about a clay is it can take a lot more strain to lose that strength. And that's why we typically don't look at it. But if you're dealing with a clay that can lose significant strength over 5 or 10% shear strain, then you should be looking at the residual strength. That is Mount Poly. That's what happened at Mount Poly. If they had done the stability analysis, understanding how that clay could have gone past the peak, gone to a residual condition or a post-peak large strain condition, prior to the rock fill and the materials above it experiencing their peaks, then they would have been fine. So there are some cases we do run a large strain post peak strength against a 1.1. That's not necessarily tailings and liquefaction. So these appendices A and B provide a lot of details on the undrained behavior. I'm going to skip along here. So when we have static conditions, this is just a simple flow chart trying to reinforce some of the points I'm making. If you have contracted soil, then use peak undrained strengths and establish a target factor safety. You're not seeing here and compare against 1.5. We're asking you to develop the target factor safety that makes sense for your project. Does the factor safety meet the target? Yes. Then check the post-peak or large strain, establish target factors of safety. Do they meet those targets as well? If so, then no further analysis is required. If they do not meet the targets, then we've developed a framework in ICOLD Appendix B to help support that situation. When we're looking at seismic conditions, after defining the dam and its geometry, ask, could the soils liquefy during a seismic event? If yes, check the post-liquefaction. If no, if the soils aren't going to liquefy, then you can do a deformation modeling. What you're not seeing here is the use of pseudostatic analyses. Many jurisdictions call out for pseudostatic analyses. There's a time and a place for pseudostatic. They need to be done carefully. They're widely misunderstood and widely misapplied. What we're suggesting is that you just go to deformation analyses, and there's a number of very good tools out there to support that. So in Appendix A, there's a number of fundamental concepts elaborated. I've touched on a bunch of these already. I'm not going to spend time going through these slides with you. I'm going to get to this one here that's pretty important. A key backbone to our Appendix B framework is brittleness. And could the tailings you're dealing with be considered brittle? On the y-axis here is a normalized shear stress, which takes the shear stress that's generated during a triaxial test or direct simple shear test and divides it by the peak shear strength that's been mobilized during that test. On the x-axis is the axial strain of the test. This D is Fajal, Brumadinho, which lost incredible strength because of the bonds breaking. This C would be similar to Fundao. I don't know if it is truly Fundao, but I think it'd be similar to Fundao. But when you're up here at B or A, you're into what we're suggesting is non-brittle or only slightly brittle. And this is very important when you're trying to assess the risks associated with your dam and the what if situation if you can't meet a factor safety targets we're talking about. So Appendix B presents a logical framework for selection of analysis techniques and selection of appropriate factors of safety when you can't meet the minimum targets we've outlined. For existing facilities, it may be necessary to accommodate existing contractive and or brittle materials and structural zones. That's like toe burns and so on, or dewatering, although I think toe burns make a lot of sense. And it emphasizes the importance of the factor safety calculated using post-liquefied shear strength over the static factor safety. So if I go back here, the reality is what many of us do in the industry is we start over here. If we have a potentially liquefiable zone in the dam, we start here and work backwards. We don't start over here, we start here. Because if we can meet the target 1.1 factor safety, post-liquefaction here, then we're fine. But if we can't, then we have a bunch of work we have to do to try to sort it out. So within Appendix B, we provide a framework that has different cases depending on the brittleness of the soils. And I'm not going to get into that with you. The bulletin will be issued in October, and I encourage you to go look at it and understand the conditions and the different targets, factors of safety we suggest. But it really boils down to how cases 1 and 2 that are not considered brittle can support reducing the factor safety using peak strengths to a 1.3 rather than 1.5. The factor safety should still be greater than 1.1, but the strength loss isn't that significant. And in my practice, I have situations where I'm not getting 1.1 here, I'm not brittle, so we're doing other things to try to develop a safety case that shows it, and it comes into triggering, comes into what the true deformations may be, running a flak analysis to try to understand what truly could happen. Would the dam truly run away from you? So just because you don't meet the targets doesn't mean you have to say the sky is falling. There's more work that can be done to build a safety case. But if you have brittle tailings like this, and particularly if there's life safety issues at stake, 1.1, don't worry about the triggering, assume it triggers and just do it. The triggering analysis is done to inform the potential probability of the event occurring, which may inform your prioritization and your timing for implementation of remedial measures, but it doesn't change the fact that you can't play a triggering game to defer to cancel the work. So in part 4 here, this is the last part, seismic stability analysis. I really want us to be using a term post-seismic stability in a certain way. Post-seismic stability is often used interchangeably with post-liquefaction, and I really wish we would do it differently. I wish we would use post-seismic stability for dams that are built of compacted fills over competent foundations, do not have liquefiable zones, no significant strain softening, and we use deformation analyses to advise us about the post-seismic stability. You could run an analysis using Shake or some tools like that that can predict the pore pressures that could be generated during a seismic event within a dam. You could put those pore pressures into the dam and actually derive a factor of safety if you wanted to. But given how many of these dams that I'm talking about here are dilative, often what happens is the shaking can lead to negative pore pressures and during the shear stresses that are developed during the shaking. So that factor safety calculation can be kind of hokey. You can still do it. But at the end of the day, I really wish we would just use post-liquefaction, post-peak stability for those ones that are liquefiable zones and save the words post-seismic for the conditions which are good. We've talked about the liquefaction of granular materials and of post-peak for clays. Now, pseudostatic analysis is often done because regulators are asking for it. And in Brazil, I'm dealing with this in particular, where every single analysis they're doing pseudostatic. They're using like a 1 in 2475 seismic event. They're calculating the pseudostatic, getting better than 1.1. They're saying they're fine, without an understanding what pseudostatic really means and what it's supposed to do and not do. What really should be happening if you have dams that do not have liquefiable elements is calculating deformations. If the calculated deformations using simplified methods aren't acceptable for the dam, then move forward with advanced deformation modeling. So I'm going to talk briefly about Hines and Griffin and Franklin, which was the early days of pseudostatic. Terzaghi preceded this, but Hines and Griffin and Franklin did a really good job looking at about 300 dams. They had a database of all the dams. They looked at how they were affected by an earthquake, how much they deformed, and they determined that if you could put a factor in your stability analysis of K, a seismic factor, which was based on 0.5 times the peak ground acceleration, they found if they did that and calculated a factor of safety greater than 1.1, then the dams wouldn't move more than 1 meter. This is a quote from Hines and Griffin. Applying this amplification factor, which gives an upper bound of 1 meter displacement for the rigid plastic sliding block, the ratio of critical acceleration to peak bedrock acceleration is 0.5. There's the 0.5 there, 1 meter is there. That's all it was intended to do. But many people interpret pseudostatic as supposed to be some magical number that tells you whether it will fail during an earthquake. That is not it. So it's some kind of simplified surrogate deformation thing, which isn't very helpful. And Hines Griffin clearly says you should not do pseudostatic if you have significant strength loss under the design seismic event. And what I'm seeing in many cases is you have liquefiable soils and still running a pseudostatic. It makes no sense. To check the liquefaction potential, then, you either look at liquefaction susceptibility to granular material, but you also need to look at cyclic softening of fine-grained materials. So as a result of those understandings of whether you have liquefiable materials or not, we're trying to move away from pseudostatic. As I said, it's misunderstood, misused, and of limited value. We are saying if you have to use it to satisfy some regulatory requirement, then please do so with caution, do it right. There's lots of work out there that tells you how to do it right. And at the end of the day, what I do in my reports is I still say, okay, Mr. Regulator or Mrs. Regulator, you asked for pseudostatic. I'm giving you pseudostatic. Now I'm going to explain to you why you don't need it. why there's better tools available, and we're going to give you a deformation analysis. But if we as an industry could write more reports like that, maybe we'd get this thing shut down over time. In terms of liquefaction, there's a number of different techniques available to try to determine whether your tailings are liquefiable. You'd work based on seeds work back in 2001. Belanger and Idris is a very comprehensive approach. This is a Belanger and Idris title page down here. I'm just going to quickly go to a case study that we have on a project where you take a look at the SPT and CPT data and calculate what's referred to as a cyclic resistance ratio. And Belanger and Idris describe how to do that. And then for different seismic events, in this case, 2,500, 1,000, and 500-year return periods, this is the cyclic stress ratio. So the 500-year event is here, 1,000-year event is here, 2,500-year event is here. So you can see how they can compare. Here's a cyclic resistance ratio at about 0.07. At about 0.07 is somewhere in here. So you can just divide the two to get a factor of safety. And that's what this shows. So when dividing the cyclic resistance ratio by the cyclic stress ratio, we can get a factor of safety against liquefaction. What this shows is a 500-year return period earthquake event might be okay, 1,000-year not so much, 2,500-year pretty bad. On this particular project, this then informed our client that, a 500-year event could happen in next year, 2 years from now. A 500-year event has some sort of realistic probability in our lifetime. And so it informed the timing with which we're to implement remedial measures. The post-liquefaction factor safety for their dam was 0.5. The peak on drain factor safety for the dam was 1.4. So the post-liquefaction told us they had a problem. They needed to do something. This helped to inform the prioritization and the implementation timing, which we're moving forward addressing. But I come back to those dams that are good dams built on competent foundations. And the methods by Bray and Travesero, and I'm very pleased to have Jonathan on the line with us here today, is the one that seems to be the most reliable. Sway is good as the poor man's. Very quick deformation analysis. I do it when I only have 5 minutes and I need to calculate a deformation. Very simply there, if I have like a 0.2 G, 100-meter high dam and magnitude 6 earthquake, it'll tell me I have about 3 or 10 centimeters of movement. Now, the Bray and Travesero is a much better method, and it might tell me I have 10 or 20 centimeters of movement, but it gives me a sense of what the movements are. And this becomes very important when you're talking to people about this whole pseudostatic issue, when they're saying I have a factor of safety of 1.2 or 1.3, therefore a settlement less than 1 meter. Well, how much less? Is it 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, 90 centimeters? So these methods are far more powerful. So that concludes my presentation. Closing remarks. We believe the slope stability guidance can now be viewed as leading international practice. It's been reviewed by a lot of people. We had Andy Foray, Peter Robertson, fellow out of Spain, fellow out of Brazil. I sent this presentation to Jorge, Scott, and Jonathan before, and they've been supportive and offered comments. So this isn't something unique. We believe this is consistent leading international practice and should be embraced. Obviously, you have to comply with the local regulations first and foremost, but don't just comply with them. And I give you an example here in Brazil. In regulation, there's no post-liquefaction. Scott Olson and I are two people that have been trying to push back against that. In fact, in my deliberations here in Brazil, I'm trying to work with IBRAM, the Mining Association in Brazil, and how can we get the regulation to change? What we understand is that they're paying attention to the ICOLD guidance that's coming because they've seen earlier drafts, and they're starting to ease off on that. Russia, the civil law, the checklists, Kazakhstan, and all the satellite countries around Russia, they don't pay attention to post-liquefaction. So don't just pay attention to the regulations. We need to use leading best practice. Thank you.
That is a great summary of what ICOLD is doing. Andy, thank you very much for sharing that with us. We do have some time here at the end, so why don't we take advantage of that? We've got a number of questions already piled up for the panel session. So we might as well take advantage of the 10 minutes, 15 minutes that we have here and start addressing some of those. So the first
Mhm.
question that came in, Andy, was what about the potential for retrogressive failures that start with some of
Absolutely.
those initial shallow failures? How is that accounted for in stability analysis?
Absolutely. The target factor safety of 1.5 we prescribed does not account for progressive failure. And that's, you then have to take a look at the situation you have, and it goes into this large strain discussion we had, and develop a target to address that. It's just simply accepting 1.5 for progressive failure is not a good idea.
And if I could, I'd like to add to that, if you have a material that is not strain softening in your outer shell
Mhm.
of a dam, and it's strain hardening and more ductile, the amount of movement that has to occur for that to get back to a factor of safety of above 1 is going to be relatively small. So you're not changing the stresses behind that shallow slough very much, and it's unlikely to develop into a retrogressive failure. It's when that
Absolutely.
material strains softening and it flows away, and now you've got an oversteepened slope behind that, where you have the issue with retrogressive failures primarily developing.
Yes, and so if you take a look at the Mount Poly paper, um, is one example, but there's another very good example, the Alameda Dam in Saskatchewan, um, which was a progressive failure discussion. And they really showed how the nonlinear deformation analysis could handle that properly,
Mhm.
right? And it also then informed their whole deformation monitoring, their alerts, their TARPs. Um, and this is what Morgenstern is saying, we have the tools, right? So when we're confronted with these rather complex situations, use limit equilibrium as a screening exercise to help guide you, but don't solely rely on it.
Right, excellent. The next question that came
Andy,
in
can I
was,
ask a question to follow up on that?
oh, certainly,
Yes.
John.
Yeah, just because there are some cases where the models within the more advanced analysis don't allow for as much movement as we see from case histories. And so wouldn't you agree that you want to use both? I think limited equilibrium is
Yes.
a good start,
Mhm.
but I think sometimes advanced analysis is not always a better insight because there are models that over constrain things and you can get things that don't
Yeah.
make sense. You really want to use both and have them
Yeah.
agree.
I agree, Jonathan. Obviously, if you have a dam with performance information, that helps. There's no doubt about that. For new dams, you're right, it's a problem. And you're absolutely right. Um, there's a whole lot of models that tell you wrong things, right? And people will hold their heart and put their hand in their heart and say that model's perfect when it's not. And I mean, your seepage analysis presentation last night, the fellow said the same thing about seepage models don't really represent reality. But the point is, you take that coupled with a limit equilibrium, coupled with your performance and your head, right? And you can then make a judgment as to what makes sense for that dam.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. The next question that came in was, do you have any thoughts on the selection of an appropriate factor of safety for 3D stability analyses, where 3D effects typically result in larger factors of safety than you get from 2D plane strain analysis?
Right. Thoughts, yes. Guidance, no. And what I mean by that is that we all know that depending on the shape of the valley, the factor of safety can increase by 10, 20, 50%, right? On a 3D analysis. The factor safety of 1.5, if you look back at the history of the factor safety of 1.5, it was developed in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And Morgenstern was all part of that, and Bishop, and all of our forebearers were looking at all that. And they were developed at 1.5 based on case studies of failures and embankments around the world that suggested that the probability of failure was equivalent to 10 to the minus 4. Now I know it's all hokey, the probability is all hokey around that, but the point is they were back analyzing those with 2D analyses. They weren't back analyzing them with 3D analyses, right?
Yes.
And so this 1.5 is based on 2D analysis experience. And when you go to 3D analyses, do not use the 1.5. I'll tell you that, right? Don't try to do a 3D to fool yourself by grabbing another 20% factor safety to get to 1.5. Okay, but use your judgment and establish what is an appropriate target for the three-dimensional factor safety.
Yeah, very good. This
Can
next
I
one,
ask an add-on question, leading the way?
Sure,
yeah,
John.
John?
Would you agree that 2D analysis methods that are available in computers are fairly well established, although they probably still have a few bugs here and there, but 3D analysis methods haven't been around as long, and you're more likely to have an error in the code or have issues of input where you don't get the right answer?
I don't know about that, Jonathan. I've only worked with limited 3D analyses in the past 5 years. I did a lot of 3D analysis 20 years ago, and I would agree with you 20 years ago.
Okay.
But in my practice, I haven't been doing that much recently to comment on that. But when you look at 2D analysis, I'm going to go into a bit of a sidebar here because I think we have a bit of time. When you look at the 2D analyses and you have this new optimization routine, I think that drives me nuts. That optimization routine drives me bonkers.
Mhm.
And it comes up with slip surfaces that are kinematically inadmissible. And I know the documents supporting it say you have to pay attention to it. But our junior engineers are very quickly turning on the optimization routine because it's giving them a safer slope stability analysis, right? And it's easy to do. You just turn on the optimization and it gives you a million slip surfaces and you come up with something interesting and wonky. What I'm trying to encourage in our practice is that if you have dams that you're building anew and you're designing from scratch, then using the optimization kind of makes some sense as long as you still come up with a kinematically reasonable failure surface because it gives you a little bit more conservatism. I'm good with that. But if I have a dam that's been built, raised, I've investigated it closely, and this isn't an ICOLD position. This is an Andy Small position, just saying, okay, right? That if I have a dam, I understand and I've got performance information. So I can remove that conservatism that the optimization brings. I can allow the optimization to still maybe inform where my critical slip surfaces may land, but I try to use some sensibility on the slip surfaces at the end of the day. So the other piece is we can spend a whole lot of time on whether the factor safety is 1.52 or 1.58. But if you vary the undrained strength from 0.20 to 0.22, that gives you a much bigger swing in the factor safety. And the whole material parameter selection thing is another discussion we could have. An example, at a workshop I did in Quebec City for CDA 4 years ago, I had a case study. I had about 15 slides in the case study where I had this undrained situation. I showed them the vein strengths, CPTs, lab testing, tracks, so DSS, all the information we had, and I asked 8 groups to come up with their recommendation on the strengths. And you can guess how many answers I got, right? That is a challenge in our industry, bigger than whether the factor safety should be 1.52 or 1.58. It's the whole parameter selection, lower bound, 20 percentile, average -1 standard deviation, all that stuff. That's still a huge issue. So coming back to your original question about inaccuracies within a slope stability model, yeah, maybe, but I think we have some bigger fish.
I would agree with you there. And that is a nice segue to this next question is what are the mechanics that, as you understand them, behind drained versus undrained failures? For example, at Mount Poly, the questioner asks, the stress path to failure is predominantly drained despite the clay having a low hydraulic conductivity, but the failure occurred under undrained conditions. And you could say the same about Feijao.
And Fundao.
Or Fundao is what I meant.
Yeah.
Fundao.
Well, and probably Feijao too.
Probably.
But I think all these undrained failures are the same, that there's some deformation, something's happening in a drained manner until it hits a tipping point that flips it to undrained. So I don't know if it answers the question, but the readers see, the person asking the question seemed to answer their own question when they asked it. So it's like, yeah, that's the mechanism. There's things that are happening in the drained world until a tipping point occurs, be it an acceleration of movement or a change in the structure of the soil or a change in the drainage conditions, the drainage boundaries that then flip it to undrained.
Right. I would tend to agree with you there. The next one, I think we have time for at least one more here. Is 20% strain a good practice for selecting residual shear strength parameters, even when the lab data shows that the material is still contracting at 20%? Or should we take the test past 20% strain for the selection of appropriate residual shear strengths?
Yeah, so I use 20%, but I recognize the questions being asked. And what I would like to have done on a couple of projects I've used a 20% is actually run a deformation model to see what makes sense in terms of what could, like with a deformation model, you can force some what if scenarios. You can force some what if scenarios that says, okay, if the dam were to really deform and move, what could the expected shear strain be under those conditions? And see if it's 10%, 15 or 20%, and then go back to your lab testing to see where it gets you. It's very hard to guess, right? But 20% seems to be a large enough number. If we keep the view that limit equilibrium is a screening tool, right? And it's intended to help you understand the stability of the dam. And we stop using it as the be all and end all. Then if as long as you take that view, then I think it's helpful. But if you're trying to squeak everything out of a limit equilibrium analysis, there's too many limitations to do that. And another thing is that the whole, like go back to the mechanics discussion, this is something that we're really wrestling with in risk assessment, is the probability of the undrained event occurring, right? So you have a probability of the factor of safety, which was based on uncertainty around your parameter selection, geometry, pore pressure conditions. That's your 10 to the minus 4. But then there's a trigger. If you remove seismicity from it, just dealing with static conditions, what's the probability of the trigger? And that's something we haven't got our head around yet as an industry, is how you couple the trigger of an undrained event, particularly static, with the actual uncertainty of your factor of safety calculation.
I would add to that the other complication of, do we understand all the potential triggering mechanisms out there? And in
Yes.
many of these cases, I would argue that there are multiple things happening, and how do we combine those probabilities? Do we use
Yes.
traditional probability theory, or is there something unusual that we need to consider?
Yep, exactly.
So it becomes very challenging. I think we have time for one final question here before we close this
Well,
section.
I'm going to pick one. Do you
Okay,
recommend
go
to
be my
conduct
guest.
because there's a point I want to make with it, pseudostatic analysis.
Perfect.
Okay. So a heap leach pad, who cares? And what I mean by that is when you're dealing with a heap leach pad, what's the tolerable deformations on a heap leach pad, right? You're not impounding water. You have water sprinkling on the thing. I'm assuming you don't have a pond on top. You don't have a core element or filter zone inside. So if that heap leach pad deformed a couple meters, is that a big deal? Right. So that's what a pseudostatic analysis is all about. It's intended to be some surrogate or proxy of deformations. I see pseudostatics being done on earthen embankments because they learned it over on dams that are doing it on earth embankments, because I thought that was some way of analyzing slope stability under seismic event. So you got to pick, the only way pseudostatic makes sense is if you have a dam that's got 1 meter of freeboard and it's like more than 50 meters high, and you have a pseudostatic less than 1, then that kind of makes some sense. But other than that, pseudostatic doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, again, you can play with it. You can do some certain things. You can change the coefficients. You can play around with it. But just doing this typical Heinz-Griffin approach, no.
Okay, and we'll talk about this in the panel sessions so we can have some good discussion on this
Yes.
item.
So I really appreciate all the questions, and Andy, thank you very much for a great presentation and great answers. We're going to be leaning on both you and John and Jorge here when we get to our panel session. We still have a lot of unanswered questions from our participants, so I'm looking forward to our panel session in a little over an hour. Right now, we're going to close this session. It is 4 p.m. Mountain Time. We will resume at 15 minutes past the hour for session number 2 with Jorge Macedo, Professor Jorge Macedo, giving us a lecture on stress deformation analysis. So with that, thank you, everyone. Take your break. We'll be back in 15 minutes.